that Zelensky is willing to almost do anything to prevent any of Trump's proposals to go through. So do you
Oh, I
see?
think I think you missed something.
Yeah,
He also said that the Ukrainians would assassinate Mr. Putin. That
no.
a Ukrainian team would get in there and assassinate Putin. He also implied in another statement that he could kill President Trump. I mean, these things are outrageous statements. They make no sense. But if you're sitting where President Trump is in the White House or Mr. Putin in the Kremlin, you need to reach the inescapable conclusion that this man must be removed, or nothing is going to happen. This man is going to burn down what little remains of Ukraine and its population. That's not in anybody's interest. The Russians don't want to do that. If they had wanted to do that, they would have handled this entire war very differently. We don't want that to happen. We want to see Ukraine survive. So Zelensky has to go. And I can think of several presidents. Certainly Eisenhower comes to mind, certainly Nixon, probably Johnson, several others, that if they were confronted with these circumstances, Zelensky would be gone.
I think someone from his administration suggested that Witkoff sounded like a Russian agent as well. It
Uh,
just, well, when America's the one country that keeps you alive and keeps the country going, it is quite remarkable the language that's yeah being used. Um, but how can the United States, if they decide that they don't want Zelensky there anymore, how can it be pushed out?
I would leave that to the imagination of your listeners. And if they're not terribly stupid,
Uh,
they will answer that question without any help from me quickly.
Yeah, a few hours ago, the former president of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, he posted a tweet when he suggested that some new pressure might be mounting on Zelensky. I have it here. Here we go. Medvedev wrote, "The Americans rolled out an excellent draft commodity deal to the Kiev freak. If the Kiev regime approves it, the drug addict will then be hanged on the Maidan like Mussolini. And if he rejects it, the United States will reset the Bandera regime. Checkmate." Again, a bit more dramatic language than I probably would have used. But you see them falling in a squeeze here, or
Look, Europe needs peace. Europe needs peace, stability, and prosperity. How does it get it as long as Zelensky and his little cabal is loose in Kiev? I don't think it's going to happen. They're going to do exactly what was described. Hang on to the bitter end. And then you end up on the Titanic. And we know how that ended very badly at the bottom of the ocean. We don't want to do that. We want Ukraine to recover. We want the population, to the extent that it can, to come back. Many will never come back. We know that. But we want to try and get as many as possible to come back. We want it to become a productive and successful country. We're not going to get there with this man, Zelensky, or the people around him. And I think this is also something that is embedded in the goals of the special military operation. They want Ukraine to be neutral. They also want it to be denazified and disarmed. And I think those things have to happen. I don't think Russia is going to have any objections to an armed force in a neutral Ukraine, provided it doesn't resemble what they had to fight in the war. I mean, it's much the same as Austria. That's why I always mention the Austrian model as the most appealing one for application in Ukraine. It can be done. But the Austrians themselves really brought the Austrian model to existence. They did all of the hard work between Eisenhower and Khrushchev, the Soviets and the Americans and the other Europeans. They drafted the treaty. They got everybody to approve it and sign on for it. We're not going to get that from Zelensky. So we absolutely need new leadership in Kiev. The longer it takes to get there, I suspect the further the Russian forces will advance.
Yeah, and well, this has been my great concern as well. That is, if a diplomatic solution is not found, which is why I'm very annoyed that the Europeans are still opposing this. Again, the longer it takes, the more we risk a complete collapse in Ukraine. And as you and I have discussed as well in the past, it's really in the final stages of the war when really the casualty numbers, again, I don't have to tell you as a student of war, but this is when the casualty really takes off, when the troops are surrounded, they have to surrender, you're having disorderly withdrawals, you're having, yeah, massacres, breakdown in communication. It's just if this happens, not only again from a humanitarian perspective would it just be a complete horror show, but the destruction of Ukraine, that is loss of all of these men as well as even more territory, it would be impossible almost for Ukraine to recover after this, and that would not be great for anyone, I think, because it's not a recipe for stability. So to have a
No.
whole country destroyed, so it's a bit remarkable for me that I stand with Ukraine crowd that yeah, they don't seem to understand what they're actually yes putting into place here.
Well, both Moscow and Washington should be very interested in ensuring that this war ends and another war does not spring forth from it. In other words, there is some sort of nothing lasts forever, but hopefully a more enduring stability and peace and prosperity in the region that we otherwise will miss. What we don't want is a situation that brings on another war. And that's my concern. The Europeans, for some reason, seem hard over. When I say Europeans, I'm talking principally about the British, French, and to a lesser extent the Germans, seem very interested in keeping these fires burning. So even if you get the most of the fire out, you have embers that you can subsequently stoke in the future. This is catastrophic. Makes no sense.
The former head of German intelligence, he also made the argument that it would be good to keep the war going for another 5 years, so it would distract the Russians while Germany, so to shield the Europeans from any Russian aggression and allow the Europeans some time to rearm. And this was something that really put some shockwaves throughout Ukraine because they kind of been running with the narrative that we stand together. We're the Europeans are here to help us. I think they're slowly coming to the realization that they're being used as meat effectively to yeah against the Russians. So I think there's going to be backlash. But yeah, just as a final question, the Russian position again, if in these negotiations between the Americans and the Russians, do you see any areas where the Russians might be willing to come meet them halfway or make some compromises? I know the neutrality issue, which encompasses both NATO expansion and security guarantees, that also troops in Ukraine, that this is likely yeah, non-negotiable. But on any of the other issues like demilitarizing Ukraine, the extent of territory, do you see any scope for possible negotiation on these issues, or not really?
That's hard to know. I think that the Russians have always been more flexible than we think, provided we met certain minimal conditions. In other words, the neutrality is one of those. The recognition of the territories they currently hold as being Russian, an end to all this nonsense about Crimea and so forth. I think they're very flexible once you get past those. Again, the question is when the fighting stops, where do they stand? And you have to think like a Russian. How far back are you willing to withdraw? And why would you withdraw without being absolutely sure that the new government in Kiev is not going to be in some way or another influenced by the hateful crowd that runs it now? And what about this thing called NATO? I don't think NATO is going to be around much longer, so I think that'll be less of an issue. And as far as the Germans are concerned, I think the Germans need cheap energy. They need to restore that. And I think the Russians are willing to do that. But the way the Germans are behaving right now, it's not going to happen. And that's not because the Russians are afraid of a re-emerging German juggernaut headed towards them. Remember Putin spent plenty of time in Germany. He knows the Germans and the Austrians. There's no interest in marching east to achieve the kinds of extreme goals that were on people's minds in 1941. I think they know that. So I'm not concerned about that. I'm more concerned about, this poisonous atmosphere that people like Merz and others continue to create by imputing to the Russians things that are wrong, that don't exist, imputing to them aspirations they don't have, a determination to march west and do what? Drink better coffee in Paris? It's absurd. They don't want to do it. There's no interest in it. I sometimes say, have you been to Russia? 99 times out of 100, they've never been there. Well, anybody who's been to Russia for any length of time, and I have, you've discovered very quickly nobody there is interested in going to war. And then people say, yeah, but what about this man, Putin? Well, I don't think we've had anybody at the top of the Russian power structure over the last 100 years that is more concerned about avoiding war with the United States and the West than Putin. And he's determined to avoid that. He wants a prosperous, stable Russia. That's it. And he certainly doesn't need any territory, as he pointed out recently. They don't need any territory. And sadly, that was Bismarck's point as well. The Germans needed no more territory than what they had. And they didn't want anybody inside the empire who was not a German. He used to point to the 2 million Poles and say, we have enough trouble with them. We don't want anybody else in the empire who's not German.
Yeah, no, it's I spoke also a few days ago with Ambassador Jack Matlock, because he helped to negotiate an end to the Cold War, and he had a fascinating comment. He said that part of the problem was the war hawks on both sides, because he said within Washington as well as they had those in Moscow, of course, but there were a lot of more the war hawks who said you can't have diplomacy. Reagan shouldn't start diplomacy because you can't trust anything the Russians say. So overcoming this narrative and this insistence that you can't talk to the opponent, you can't do diplomacy. But once they were able to push through that, of course, they could reach an end. I wish we would learn something from this, but I doubt it.
Well, the interesting thing is whether or not you like Donald Trump, you must give him credit for having the courage and the determination and the vision to smash down what remains of the Cold War and bury it in favor of normalizing relations with Russia. Europeans should take that as a blessing. I remember when the Europeans were frightened during the Reagan years that they would end up in the middle of a large nuclear exchange because they were convinced that Reagan wanted to nuke Russia. How things change. It's almost to the point where it doesn't matter who's president, whatever the president says or does, Europeans don't seem to like it, but they should be much happier with with Trump, who is pursuing peace.